He didn't mean to become a hero. Caleb Turner, a quiet single dad and Marine veteran, was just taking his daughter to court to finish paperwork. But when he saw two officers violently confront a woman on the courthouse steps, he stepped forward, not knowing she was a federal judge, and that the moment would spark a national reckoning. What happened next would shake the justice system, expose buried lies, and change all three of their lives forever. The wind carried a quiet chill through the marble columns of the federal courthouse, a whisper of fall that hinted at change. Caleb Turner adjusted the worn olive-green jacket draped over his broad shoulders. The fabric, faded from years of use, still bore the faint outlines of his old Marine insignia. Beside him, his daughter Tessa trotted along the granite steps, her white canvas shoes softly tapping like a lullaby against the stone. "Are you sure it's here, Daddy?" she asked, clutching a folded paper in one hand and a worn plush rabbit in the other. Caleb gave a faint nod. "Suite 403, Veterans Assistance Office." He paused near the security checkpoint, where the usual bustle of suits, clerks, and officers moved like clockwork. His hand gently reached down to brush Tessa's curly hair behind her ear. She looked up, studying his face, the way only an 8-year-old could, curiously, lovingly searching for signs of unspoken stories. "Why do you have to come to the courthouse? You didn't do anything wrong." Caleb smiled softly, the kind that barely bent his lips, but said everything. "Not all stories in court are about something wrong, sweetheart. Some are about making things right." Tessa seemed to absorb that, then returned to fiddling with her bunny's ear. Caleb scanned the corridor, then leaned down. "Stay close, all right?" They approached the side entrance. That's when everything shifted. A sharp voice cut through the morning haze. "I said step back, ma'am." Caleb's eyes snapped toward the stairs just beyond the security zone. A black woman, maybe in her late 40s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit and heels, was standing her ground as two uniformed officers, both white, both agitated, barred her from entering. "I have clearance," the woman said, her voice calm but firm, her hand raised with a small ID card. "You're not authorized to be here," one officer barked. His name tag read, Martinez. The other officer flanked him with his hand on his baton. Then it happened. Martinez struck the woman's hand, knocking her ID card to the floor. Papers burst from the leather briefcase she held, scattering like leaves in the wind. As she bent down to retrieve them, he grabbed her by the wrist and shoved her roughly against the stone wall. A sickening crack echoed across the plaza. Tessa gasped. Caleb's heart thundered. Before he knew it, his instincts took over. "Stay right here," he told Tessa, his voice suddenly cold, precise, an echo of another life. He stepped forward fast, but measured, placing himself directly between the woman and the two officers. "Sir, move back," Martinez warned, puffing up his chest. But Caleb didn't budge. His gaze locked with Martinez's, calm, unshaken, and dangerous, in a way only those who faced real fear could understand. "She showed you her ID. She's not resisting. There's no cause for force. Are you interfering with a federal officer, sir?" "No," Caleb said, voice steady. "I'm witnessing an unlawful use of force." The second officer shifted uncomfortably. Martinez, however, narrowed his eyes and stepped closer. "You have no idea who she is." Caleb glanced over his shoulder. The woman had regained her balance and was quietly brushing dust from her slacks. Her composure remained, but her eyes flickered with pain, and not just physical. "I don't care who she is," Caleb said. "I care that you just shoved an unarmed woman without cause, and I have a child watching." The words hung heavy in the morning air. For a long second, no one moved. A few bystanders nearby had pulled out their phones. One clerk whispered something into a walkie-talkie. Finally, the second officer murmured, "Martinez." "Just let it go." With a final glare, Martinez released his stance and took a step back. Fine. Let the judge sort it out. The woman blinked, caught in a moment of disbelief. She looked at Caleb, truly seeing him for the first time. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Are you all right? I've been better," she replied, straightening. "But yes, and I appreciate what you just did. Most would have just watched." Before Caleb could respond, a court officer approached briskly. "Ma'am, we need to clarify your credentials inside. Please follow me." She turned to Caleb. "Will you come with me?" As a witness, Caleb looked down at Tessa, who was now watching with wide eyes, clutching her bunny tight. He turned back. "Yes, I'll come." Inside, under the hum of fluorescent lights and polished walls, Caleb followed the woman through the echoing halls of justice. Tessa clung to his hand. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But something about her, the fire in her gaze, the quiet strength in how she stood her ground, told him this wasn't over. And something deep inside him stirred. It had been a long time since Caleb Turner walked into conflict for someone else. But today, it felt right. And this time, he wasn't alone. The courtroom door thudded shut behind them, with a weight that felt almost ceremonial. Caleb Turner scanned the room instinctively, walls lined with cherrywood panels, a judge's bench looming ahead like a quiet throne, and rows of empty pews awaiting the day's audience. Beatrice Cole walked beside him, her movements steady, but guarded as if each step was a calculation. There was a cut near her temple barely visible now, but Caleb had seen enough in combat to know it would bruise. "I'm Beatrice," she said quietly as they reached the front row. "Beatrice Cole." "Caleb," he replied. "Caleb Turner. And this is my daughter, Tessa." Tessa gave a shy little wave with 2 fingers gripping her plush rabbit with the other hand. Beatrice's gaze softened. "You were brave out there." "I've learned," Caleb replied evenly, "that silence enables worse things." Beatrice nodded slowly, her voice almost a whisper. "So have I." The bailiff entered, stern-faced, clipboard in hand, and motioned toward Beatrice. "You'll wait here. The district judge has authorized a preliminary hearing due to security concerns. You'll be treated as a material subject until this is sorted out." Caleb's jaw clenched slightly. "She's not under arrest. No formal charges yet," the bailiff replied, not unkindly. "But she'll need to be heard. You're listed as her witness, I am." "All right. Stay seated. This'll be quick." The bailiff stepped out. Silence fell. Beatrice sat down beside Caleb, pressing her hands together tightly in her lap. For a woman who had just been assaulted and practically treated like a criminal, her composure was remarkable. Tessa whispered, "Is that man going to yell again?" Caleb pulled her close, his arm wrapping gently around her shoulders. "No, honey. We're safe now." His voice was calm, but his eyes remained alert, scanning each creak of the door and each step in the hallway. Old habits died hard. Beatrice looked over. "She's brave. She gets that from her mother." There was a pause. Beatrice didn't pry. Then she asked, "Are you always this calm under pressure?" Caleb gave a dry chuckle. "When you've carried a wounded friend across sand under fire, you learn to slow the moment down." Beatrice tilted her head, slightly studying him. "Marine." He nodded once. 13 years. "That explains a lot," she said, her tone warmer now. "You have the eyes of someone who's seen too much and still chooses not to look away." It was the kind of thing people rarely said out loud. Caleb blinked. That kind of insight usually unnerved him, but coming from her, it felt respectful. Seen. A creak at the back drew their attention as the courtroom doors opened again. Officer Martinez entered with swagger in his step and arrogance in his eyes. He took a seat beside a stone-faced district attorney, and leaned back like a man rehearsing for a promotion. Beatrice straightened, her back no longer just stiff, it was regal. The judge entered moments later, a temporary presider called in to oversee the hearing. Everyone stood. The room held its breath. "Be seated," came the voice from the bench. "This is a security review regarding an incident this morning involving an unauthorized entry and alleged use of force. Ms. Cole, please step forward." Beatrice rose. She walked toward the podium, heels clicking in even rhythm. Tessa squeezed Caleb's hand. "Your Honor," Beatrice began, her tone crisp but controlled. "I am not here unlawfully. I am a federal judge assigned to this courthouse. I was scheduled to attend a judiciary review panel on the 3rd floor. I presented my credentials, and I was physically assaulted by Officer Martinez." A murmur stirred behind them. The judge lifted a brow. "Do you have evidence of your clearance?" "I do," she said, pulling a second uncrumpled copy of her clearance form from a folder. "Additionally, I was wearing my government-issued identification badge, which was knocked from my hand." The judge turned to Martinez. "Officer, your report states the subject was unidentified, uncooperative, and suspected of breaching classified materials." "Do you have evidence of that?" Martinez cleared his throat. She approached, aggressively refused to halt, and carried a briefcase with no visible credentials. Her actions appeared suspicious, especially in light of current security protocols. Beatrice spoke before the judge could respond. "There is a difference between appeared suspicious and merited physical assault." Martinez's jaw tightened. The judge looked toward Caleb. "Mr. Turner, you were present?" Caleb stood, his hand still resting on Tessa's shoulder. "Yes, Your Honor. I saw the whole thing." She didn't raise her voice, didn't resist, didn't make any threats. She was calm. She presented her ID, and the officer slapped it out of her hand. "Did you record the incident?" Caleb hesitated, then reached into his coat and retrieved a small phone. "I did." The room froze. The judge nodded. "We'll review the footage privately. Thank you." As Caleb sat back down, Martinez leaned over and whispered something to the DA. Beatrice noticed, but so did Caleb. He leaned toward her and said quietly, "They're trying to cover themselves." Beatrice gave a faint smile. "Then they don't know who they're up against." She turned to Tessa. "Sweetheart, thank you for being so strong." Tessa blinked, surprised. "Me, yes, you. You reminded your dad to be brave today." Tessa looked at her father with pride. Caleb smiled, then turned toward Beatrice. "And you reminded me some people still fight with words, and win." For the first time all morning, Beatrice laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was real. The hallway leading to courtroom 2B was narrow and dim, its walls lined with government-issued art and faded plaques commemorating forgotten milestones. But to Tessa Bloom, it felt like a tunnel from one world into another. She held tightly to Caleb's hand, her rabbit's stitched ear dragging across the floor as she walked. The polished marble tiles echoed each of their steps, amplifying her father's quiet strength, like the footsteps of a soldier returning to the battlefield. Not with a weapon this time, but with truth. Beatrice Cole walked just ahead, still dignified, despite the morning's assault. Her charcoal gray suit, though wrinkled, now seemed to fit her like armor. She didn't look back, but Caleb could feel the tension in her spine, the way she squared her shoulders before pushing the door open. The courtroom inside was a living paradox, both grand and sterile austere, yet deeply human. Light poured in through tall windows dusted with age, illuminating rows of mahogany benches and a bench raised beneath the seal of the United States District Court. But it wasn't the architecture that set Caleb on edge. It was the silence, the kind of silence that wasn't absence but expectation. Inside, a small crowd had already gathered legal assistance, a junior prosecutor, 2 reporters from the Capitol Tribune, and at least one familiar face, Officer Martinez, sitting smugly beside his department's counsel. His uniform was spotless now. His expression calculated neutrality. The bailiff nodded toward Beatrice and Caleb. "Please take your seats. Judge Daniels is reviewing the footage." Beatrice turned to Caleb before they sat. "He won't recognize me. I haven't served with Daniels in over 5 years. He was appointed in another circuit." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That works in your favor. Not if the briefing folder they gave him says I'm the accused." They sat in the second pew. Tessa climbed onto the bench beside her father, curling into his side. Caleb draped an arm around her instinctively. A sharp rap of the gavel broke the air. "All rise." Judge Emery Daniels entered briskly, mid-60s, white-haired and efficient. He adjusted his glasses as he took his seat. "This session is hereby in order to determine the nature of events that occurred outside this courthouse at approximately 8 to 12 a.m. this morning. Parties present Officer Martinez and legal counsel." "Your Honor," the attorney responded first. "Beatrice Cole present, representing herself for now." Daniels didn't blink. Noted. He glanced toward Caleb. "And you are Caleb Turner. Witness and civilian observer, sir." Daniels studied him for a moment longer than necessary, perhaps noting the military bearing or the unmistakable tone of someone who spoke with discipline. "You may remain, Mr. Turner. I understand you submitted footage." "Yes, Your Honor," Caleb replied, handing a flash drive to the clerk. Judge Daniels inserted it into the built-in screen system. A moment later, grainy video played across 2 flat panels flanking the bench. The silence was suffocating. The footage began just as Martinez raised his hand. Smack. Beatrice's ID flew from her hand. Papers spilled. Her body hit the wall with a dull thud. The audio crackled with Martinez's voice. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in courthouses." Gasps rippled through the room. The court reporter's fingers hesitated. The prosecutor stiffened. Daniels raised a hand to pause the video. "Officer Martinez, is that your voice?" Martinez cleared his throat. "The footage is edited. It's misleading. I was responding to a perceived threat." Daniels gave him a look so cold it could have frozen stone. She held a leather briefcase and government ID. She didn't identify herself as a judge, Martinez insisted. "She didn't have to," Beatrice said calmly. "You never asked." Daniels gestured toward her. "You may approach." Beatrice rose heels, echoing sharply, and approached the center podium. Her hands were steady. "I request recognition of my position and status. I am a federal judge assigned to this district's Appellate Integrity Review Board. My name and clearance were on file for today's judicial ethics session, set for 9 a.m. on the 3rd floor. She reached into her bag and laid down a laminated appointment schedule, her bar license, and her federal ID badge, now retrieved and no longer bent. Caleb watched the judge's face shift slowly, almost imperceptibly. His brows narrowed, his mouth flattened. You're that Beatrice Cole." Beatrice gave a single nod. "I clerked under Judge Winston in D.C. when you chaired the Veteran Reintegration Circuit." Beatrice looked him in the eye. "And I never imagined I'd be mistaken for a criminal in my own courthouse." Martinez stood suddenly. "This is absurd. How could I know?" "Sit down," Daniel snapped. His voice carried the weight of decades on the bench. "You had a duty to de-escalate, not to degrade, not to assault." Tessa leaned up against her father's arm. "Is that man in trouble, Daddy?" Caleb whispered. "He should be." Beatrice returned to her seat, every step measured. Daniels leaned forward. "Ms. Cole." "Pardon me, Judge Cole. We'll call a recess to reconvene with appropriate federal oversight. You are not under any suspicion. I apologize on behalf of this court." Beatrice didn't nod. She didn't gloat. She simply looked toward Tessa and gave a small, exhausted smile. Then Caleb saw it, just a flicker in Martinez's eyes. Fear. And in Beatrice's fire. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The courtroom was still echoing with the word recess when Caleb saw Martinez whisper something into his attorney's ear. Not a word of remorse. No apology. Just quiet calculation. Beatrice stood silently by the window, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. The sunlight framed her like a portrait, still and unyielding. Tessa, seated beside her father, scribbled something on the back of a paper napkin she had found in his coat pocket. She was drawing a rabbit standing between two big people, one smiling, one frowning. Caleb glanced at it and smiled faintly. "You've got good instincts," he whispered. "Just like you," Tessa whispered back. The courtroom reopened 20 minutes later. Gone was the initial tension of misunderstanding, replaced now with the tension of revelation. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone had heard Martinez's slur, but procedure demanded formal review, and Judge Daniels had returned this time with a court recorder and a federal ethics observer quietly seated near the exit. "All parties ready?" Daniels asked. Beatrice gave a short nod. Caleb did the same. Martinez's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, we wish to formally submit a supplemental incident report regarding the events of this morning," he said, holding up a stapled document. "It includes detailed timestamps, a background investigation on Ms. Cole's entrance, and officer testimony." Daniels frowned. "Background investigation." The attorney cleared his throat. "We were concerned, given the confusion of identity, and the fact that Ms. Judge Cole did not appear in standard judicial attire, nor did she enter via the designated secure channel." Beatrice turned her voice, cutting through the room like a piano chord struck in silence. "So now the narrative is, I caused confusion because I didn't wear a robe." The attorney shifted. "We simply wish to clarify the chain of events." Judge Daniels flipped through the document. As he read, his face darkened. "These statements," he said, raising an eyebrow, "allege that Judge Cole—" "Let's use proper titles. Shall we arrived aggressively, failed to follow orders, and refused to provide documentation. Yet we all just saw the footage contradicting those very points." Martinez's attorney spoke quickly. "Your Honor, there is also mention of sensitive materials in the briefcase, which Ms. Cole refused to reveal." Beatrice stepped forward. "That briefcase contained sealed personnel evaluations for 3 veteran court officers under internal review. I am not authorized to disclose those contents to anyone outside the review board, including Officer Martinez." "And did he request to see those documents?" Daniels asked. Beatrice's voice was dry. "He didn't get that far. He chose to slap them out of my hand instead." Gasps echoed again, even among the few staff seated behind. Daniels turned sharply toward Martinez. "Is that true? Did you attempt to search the briefcase before initiating physical contact?" Martinez stood. "Your Honor, the suspect, excuse me. The individual displayed suspicious behavior consistent with answer the question." A long pause. "No, I did not." Daniels leaned back slowly. "So your justification for escalation was based on assumption, not evidence." Caleb saw it again just behind Martinez's polished exterior. The crack forming. Beatrice added, voice steady. "And for the record, Judge Daniels, I was cleared for access through the side entrance weeks ago. The security office logs will confirm that." Daniels turned to the clerk. "Request those logs. Immediately." As the clerk stepped out, Martinez's attorney began backpedaling. "Even if procedural mistakes were made, we argue they were made in the interest of protecting federal security. There was no malicious intent." "No malicious intent?" Beatrice asked. "Tell me, what intent do you assign to the words, 'filthy animals like you'?" Martinez looked down. The courtroom fell silent. Daniels took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. He looked tired now, not just from the day, but from the weight of witnessing justice teeter on the edge of corruption. Mr. Turner, the judge said suddenly, "You've served in the military, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Marine Corps. In your experience, what's the rule about escalation?" Caleb stood. "De-escalate, unless there's clear and present danger. Always, even in combat zones." "And do you believe Judge Cole presented danger?" "None whatsoever," Caleb said. "She was calm, respectful, and non-threatening. I intervened only because my daughter was with me, and I knew that if I didn't, she'd carry that moment forever." Daniels gave a long, thoughtful nod. "That's the heart of this, isn't it?" He looked around the room. Children are watching. Young staffers are watching. Civilians, veterans, our fellow Americans. They're all watching to see whether the law protects only those who enforce it or those who believe in it. He stood. "This court will now move to a formal ethics inquiry into Officer Martinez's conduct. Until further notice, he is suspended from courthouse duty pending review. Judge Cole is cleared of any suspicion and will be reinstated on the judiciary panel immediately." The gavel fell once loud and final. Court adjourned. As the murmurs began to rise, Beatrice turned to Caleb, the steel in her expression, giving way to something gentler. "Thank you," she said again. "Not just for the video, but for stepping in. Most people wouldn't have." Caleb offered a quiet shrug. "I didn't think. I just acted." "No," Beatrice replied. "You thought exactly the right thing." Tessa tugged at Beatrice's sleeve. "Are you okay now?" Beatrice smiled down at her. "I am now." And as they walked out of the courtroom together side by side, something unspoken settled between them. Not victory, not vindication. Something better. The beginning of truth finding its voice. By the time the courthouse doors closed behind them, the air outside had shifted. What had begun as a bitter morning full of cold bureaucracy and hidden violence was now wrapped in a fragile kind of calm. The city moved around them, judges, attorneys, civilians, blending back into their routines as if nothing had happened. But for Caleb, for Tessa, and especially for Beatrice Cole, something had changed. The three walked in silence along the edge of the courthouse plaza, boots and heels, tapping lightly against concrete, dusted with the first fallen leaves of autumn. "I think I liked the judge," Tessa said suddenly, her voice breaking through the quiet like a bell. Beatrice glanced down, smiling. "That's kind of you. You didn't yell or cry. Most people cry when they're hurt." Beatrice didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the horizon, where the distant Capitol dome gleamed beneath the afternoon light. "I've cried," she said eventually. "Just not when they expect me to." Caleb gave her a sidelong glance. There was something about her voice when she said that, flat, but not detached. Steady. Like someone who had weathered storms before and learned to walk upright through them. "You want to get a coffee?" he asked, surprising even himself. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. He gestured down the block. "Corner cafe. Good lattes. They let kids draw on the sugar packets." Tessa's eyes lit up. Beatrice considered it for a moment. Then, "All right. 1 coffee." Inside the cafe, the air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and old wood. The three settled into a booth by the window, Caleb and Tessa on one side, Beatrice across from them. A teenage barista brought their drinks with minimal fanfare. Tessa immediately began stacking creamer cups like building blocks. Beatrice stirred her black coffee slowly, her eyes watching the swirl of heat rise above it. "You said something earlier, in the courtroom, about your daughter watching, that if you didn't act, she'd carry it forever." Caleb nodded. "That's right." Beatrice looked at Tessa, then back at Caleb. "That's rare. Most people say they act for justice, for principle, for country. But you acted for her." Caleb leaned back in the booth. "Justice is abstract. Kids are not." That drew a small laugh from her, spoken like a parent. He nodded once. Lost my wife 3 years ago. Tessa was 5. I'm sorry. He shrugged. Cancer doesn't ask for permission. Beatrice didn't reply, but the air between them changed, softened. She reached into her bag and pulled out a napkin, unfolded it carefully, and placed it on the table. On the inside, neatly folded and protected, was the court's briefing schedule for that morning. Caleb scanned the names. One line stood out: Cole B., panel chair, Federal Judicial Oversight Committee. You were supposed to lead it. She nodded. 9 months of preparation. Case studies, revisions, testimonies from military veterans who had experienced discrimination in public courts. Caleb's brows lifted. Veterans. Beatrice's expression deepened. That's why I was late this morning. I stopped by the VA Medical Center to pick up a sealed testimonial packet. A Marine named Howard Malone. He hasn't spoken in years. PTSD. He sent a written account of being manhandled during a traffic stop. I wasn't going to walk into that room without his words. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. You don't sound like most judges. I'm not. Tessa looked up. What's a judge's job? Beatrice smiled. To listen carefully, and then speak carefully. Tessa nodded, apparently satisfied. There was a long pause. The cafe was now half empty. Outside, the sun had begun to lower, painting the windows gold. Caleb spoke softly. They're going to come after you, you know. Martinez's department, his attorney. I know, she said. You ready for that? Beatrice met his gaze head on. I've been underestimated before. They think a black woman in a suit is easier to dismiss, but they forget something. What's that? She set down her cup. We don't break easily. We bend. We outlast. We learn the rules so well we teach them to others. Caleb let out a breath. That's not just quiet strength. That's steel. Beatrice gave a rare smile. Funny. I always thought my strength made people uncomfortable. It probably does, Caleb said. That's how you know it's real. Tessa tugged on Caleb's sleeve. Can I go to the window and draw stay where I can see you? Caleb said. As Tessa skipped off her curls bouncing behind her, Beatrice watched her with something close to wonder. She's remarkable, Beatrice said. So sensitive, but not afraid. Caleb followed her gaze. She's seen things kids shouldn't see. But I promised her, no matter how dark the world got, I'd make sure she still believed in the light. Beatrice looked back at him. And today, you kept that promise. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, sirens hummed faintly in the distance, lost in the lull of the golden hour. Inside, 2 people sat across from each other, neither quite strangers, not yet something more, but something real had begun. Not with a grand gesture, but with a moment of quiet strength. The next morning, Caleb awoke to the sound of his old phone vibrating angrily on the nightstand. It didn't ring. It didn't beep. It buzzed, insistent, urgent, like a warning on the battlefield. He groaned and reached for it, the familiar stiffness of an old back injury flaring as he sat up. The screen was glowing with text messages. One from an unfamiliar number stood out. Turn on the news. You're in it. Jackie from Capital Tribune. He blinked. Then a second message popped up. Caleb. It's viral. The video. Everything. Marcus, VA Media Liaison. Caleb swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his instincts on high alert now. In the small living room of their modest 2-bedroom apartment, Tessa was already curled up on the couch in her pajamas, rabbit in hand, eyes wide as she stared at the muted television screen. He grabbed the remote and unmuted it. This exclusive footage taken by a former U.S. Marine and single father has ignited outrage across the country. The screen cut to the familiar footage, Martinez's hand, flying Beatrice's head, snapping back documents, fluttering through the air like broken wings. A CNN-style news banner read, "Federal judge mistaken for intruder, assaulted by court officer. Below it, singledad veterans footage, sparks civil rights firestorm. Caleb stared silent. Daddy Tessa whispered, "Is that really you?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's us." Her eyes brimmed with something like pride, and something else, something quieter. "You stopped it," she said. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We did." A knock at the door broke the moment. He moved to open it, every muscle in his body coiled out of habit. On the other side stood a woman in a blazer, hair pulled back, ID badge clipped to her lapel. "Mr. Turner, I'm Vanessa Price, press secretary for the District Ethics Review Board. Judge Cole asked me to speak with you." Caleb blinked. "She's all right." "She's composed," Vanessa said with a smile. "She also asked me to deliver this." From her folder, she produced a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Caleb, I believe things are about to change, and not quietly. The video you shared opened the first door. Now the others must follow. I'm asking you to meet me at the Judiciary Hall at noon. There's something we need to do together. Tell Tessa I requested her presence too." Beatrice. By the time they arrived at Judiciary Hall, reporters had already begun circling like hawks over a battlefield. But unlike what Caleb remembered from his days overseas, these weren't soldiers or enemies. These were spectators, witnesses, and some were allies. Beatrice was waiting by the side entrance. This time she was unmistakably herself, dressed not in charcoal gray, but in a deep blue suit with gold pins at the collar. Regal, controlled, her posture straightened the moment she saw them. Tessa ran up first, and Beatrice knelt gracefully to greet her. "Your drawing," she said, pulling something from her briefcase. "I kept it." Tessa gasped. It was the napkin she had drawn on, now laminated. "Why did you save it?" the girl asked. "Because sometimes truth starts in small hands." Caleb stepped beside them, watching the moment with quiet awe. Inside the building, they were ushered into a side conference room. A live broadcast was already being prepared. Microphones, bright lights, murmuring tech crews. "You're going on record?" Caleb asked. Beatrice nodded. "I've spent a lifetime letting the law speak for me. But this time, I speak first." The room hushed as a producer counted down. Beatrice stepped to the podium. Caleb stood behind her just off camera, one hand resting protectively on Tessa's shoulder. "Good afternoon," Beatrice began, voice firm but not theatrical. "My name is Judge Beatrice Cole. I serve as a federal circuit judge in this district, and have done so for over a decade. Yesterday I was assaulted on the steps of the very courthouse I have served." She paused. "Some say this was a mistake, a moment of confusion, a misread." Another pause. "I say it was the natural consequence of unchecked power prejudice and the failure to ask a single question before passing judgment on both who I was and what I represented." She let the silence breathe. But something extraordinary happened. A father, a veteran, a stranger stepped forward, not out of ambition, not for applause, but because his daughter was watching. She turned slightly, meeting Caleb's gaze with something far more personal than gratitude. Let the world watch too. The flash of cameras, the eruption of questions, the surge of digital energy that followed it was like a dam breaking. Caleb stood steady through it all, not because he was used to attention, but because deep down he knew the truth had found daylight. After the press conference, as they stood outside under a golden tree, shedding its first leaves, Caleb turned to her. "You sure you're ready for the storm that's coming?" Beatrice looked up at him. Her expression was neither weary nor afraid. "I've lived my whole life in the storm, Caleb, but for the first time I'm not walking through it alone." And for the first time, he believed her. Caleb stood in the hallway of his apartment later that evening, a quiet weight pressing against his chest, like the lingering humidity before a storm. The apartment was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional page turn from Tessa's room, where she read curled up in bed, her rabbit beside her. He stared at the photo frame on the wall. It was old, slightly crooked, and inside was a single picture his wedding day. Lucy wore a sleeveless dress with wildflowers woven through her hair, her laughter frozen mid-burst as Caleb kissed her cheek. His Marine Corps uniform stiff, but his expression soft. She had been his anchor in the chaos, the only person who could see through his quiet intensity and remind him he was still human. Her death hadn't come suddenly. Leukemia rarely did. But when she left, it felt as though the ground beneath him had cracked open and swallowed every version of the man he used to be. Since then, every morning had been about showing up. For Tessa. For his promise. His thumb brushed the edge of the frame. He whispered into the silence. I did what you asked. I stood up when it mattered. And still, something deep inside him stirred an ache, not from trauma but from purpose, long buried and now beginning to pulse again. He stepped out onto the fire escape, breathing in the cool air, his coffee steaming in his hands. The city below buzzed faintly. Sirens in the distance, the soft crackle of a late-night radio from the unit across the alley. A voice came from his phone speaker. It was playing back an old voicemail, one of the last Lucy had ever left him during a hospital stay. You always think you're supposed to fix everything, Caleb. But it's not about fixing. It's about showing up, especially when Tessa's watching. He closed his eyes. That voice had never left him. Not truly. The next morning, Caleb walked Tessa to school like always, except this time parents turned their heads. Are you one of them? Asked. Caleb gave a polite nod and kept walking. Another mother, this one in scrubs, smiled. My sister served under Judge Cole. You did something good. Tessa tugged on his hand. Daddy, people are staring. He kneeled beside her. That's okay. Sometimes when the truth comes out, people don't know where to look. But you just keep your eyes forward. She nodded seriously and then leaned in. Can we visit Mom's garden today? That caught him by surprise. Of course, he said softly. Later that afternoon, Caleb drove them to the memorial garden Lucy had once planted behind the VA hospital. It had become overgrown since her death, but a few volunteers still kept it from becoming wild. They walked between rows of white hydrangeas and tall, black-eyed Susans. Tessa skipping ahead as she brushed her fingers along the petals. Beatrice was already there. He blinked, surprised. She wore simple jeans and a navy peacoat, kneeling near the far end of the garden, with a small trowel in her hand, gently digging around the roots of a rosebush. I hope you don't mind, she said without turning. Your daughter told me about this place at the cafe. Caleb looked over at Tessa, who shrugged with an innocent grin. She asked. He stepped beside Beatrice. You garden I used to. With my mother. When I was little, we didn't have much, but we had this patch of dirt in the back of our apartment building. She used to say, when the world feels ugly, plant something that proves it wrong. Caleb looked down at the patch she was tending. That's something Lucy would have said. They fell into a comfortable silence as Tessa wandered further down the path. Beatrice finally looked up. You've been quiet since the press conference. Caleb shrugged. You were magnificent. I didn't want to step on it. That's not what I meant. She stood now, brushing her hands clean. I meant you've been quiet with yourself, holding something in. He exhaled. I thought I was done with purpose, that I'd spent all of it overseas. But standing up in that courtroom, watching people actually listen to something right, I felt like I'd been asleep. And now you're awake, she said gently. He nodded. She studied him for a long moment. You know, most people think power is loud, that it has to shout or command or take up space. But sometimes power is knowing who you are, and not letting anyone rewrite it. He looked at her eyes, narrowing slightly. You talking about me or you? She smiled faintly. Both. Tessa came running back, arms full of purple asters she had carefully picked. Can we plant these for Mommy? Caleb dropped to one knee. We sure can. Together, the three of them dug a small patch near the rose bush. Beatrice held the stems, while Caleb guided Tessa's hands through the dirt. When they finished, they stood in silence. Three souls bound not by blood, but by truth memory, and something even deeper. Hope. As they turned to leave, Beatrice gently slipped her hand around Caleb's elbow just for a second. I'm glad it was you, she whispered. The man who stepped forward. And in that moment, under the autumn sun, the war Caleb thought he had left behind, both the one overseas and the one within, finally began to quiet. Beatrice Cole stood in the elevator alone, watching her reflection shift in the brushed metal doors as they rose toward the 4th floor of the district courthouse. She wore black today, not in mourning, but in statement. Her hair was pulled into a tight, elegant bun, her badge clipped deliberately high on her lapel, not for display, but for reminder. As the elevator dinged, she stepped out and moved down the hallway with the same grace she had once reserved for courtrooms and ethics panels. Today she wasn't here to request permission. She was here to exercise it. 2 security officers straightened as she approached the restricted judiciary access room. Judge Cole, one of them, said, hesitant, I'm here to retrieve my official judiciary file from Panel 7. Authorization was sent this morning. He glanced at the clipboard and nodded. Yes, ma'am. You're clear. She paused. Has Officer Martinez been granted access to this floor since the inquiry? The second guard shook his head. He was suspended from courthouse grounds per Judge Daniels's order. There's been internal noise, though. His union filed an appeal. Beatrice's jaw tightened slightly. That appeal will take its proper course. Until then, the law stands. She entered the room without another word. Inside the space was quiet, filled with locked file drawers, frosted glass, and the hum of a humming fluorescent light above. She moved to the cabinet labeled Ethics, Oversight, Judiciary Appointments, and withdrew the documents from the panel she was supposed to lead the morning she was assaulted. Among them were sealed records, transcripts of whistleblower reports, and one envelope she hadn't yet opened, sent anonymously. She broke the seal with a letter opener. Inside was a single page, 3 officers. Multiple complaints. Sealed each time. One name always surfaces: Martinez. Signed a friend of the court. Beatrice folded the page and slid it into her folder. No emotion flickered across her face. Not rage, not fear. Only resolve. Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Caleb sat on a bench in the main atrium, watching Tessa quietly draw on the back of a manila envelope. She had insisted on coming. He glanced at his watch. Beatrice had asked him to wait, said she had to prepare something. That was 2 hours ago. He didn't mind waiting. There was something about being in the building again this time, without tension crackling around every corner. People passed them and nodded, not in recognition of fame, but in something deeper. Acknowledgement. Respect. A man in a crisp navy suit stopped near the bench and leaned in quietly. You're Caleb Turner, right? Yes. Name's Tom Henderson. Judiciary Operations. He handed Caleb a folded note. Judge Cole asked me to give you this when she was done. You'll know when to open it. The man left just as quickly as he came. Caleb looked at the note in his hands, but didn't unfold it. Instead, he looked at Tessa. What are you drawing this time? A woman standing on a mountain, she said, not looking up. And a rabbit. He chuckled. Interesting combo. She's not alone, Tessa added. The rabbit makes her braver. He looked at the note again. Upstairs, Beatrice entered the small hearing room assigned for internal judiciary sessions. It was dimly lit utilitarian and devoid of the formality of courtrooms, but it held power just the same. She stood alone at the head of the table. One by one, members of the Judiciary Ethics panel filed in. Some were old colleagues. Some were young lawyers with sharp eyes and sharper skepticism. When everyone was seated, Beatrice began. I've called this session under Emergency Order 18A. As per subsection 4 of Judicial Integrity Protocol, I am exercising my authority as chair of the Oversight Panel. A young male member interrupted. But that panel was suspended due to the incident involving you, wasn't it? Beatrice met his gaze without blinking. Temporarily postponed, not revoked. My appointment was never rescinded, and I now hold critical evidence. She placed the sealed anonymous letter in front of them, alongside formal records, showing Martinez's prior citations, complaints that had been filed, and later dismissed due to lack of oversight. The room fell quiet. A middle-aged woman near the end of the table cleared her throat. If even half of this is verified, it exposes serious rot within courthouse security. Beatrice nodded. Then it's time we stop letting it fester. There were no outbursts, no cheers, only nods, and quiet agreement. Power, when wielded correctly, didn't need to raise its voice. Downstairs, Caleb unfolded the note. In Beatrice's handwriting, it's time to return. Come to courtroom 3A. Bring Tessa. He stood gently tapping Tessa's shoulder. We're going upstairs. Is the judge going to fight someone? Tessa asked. Caleb smiled. No, baby. She already did. When they entered courtroom 3A, the lights were dimmed, and only a handful of people were present. Court clerks, a couple of reporters, and a lone security officer. Then from the side door, Beatrice appeared. She had changed. Gone was the suit. Now she wore a flowing black judicial robe with thin gold trim. The courtroom stood in hushed disbelief. The clerk stepped forward, voice resonant and ceremonial. All rise. Even Caleb froze for a second. The clerk's voice rang out clearly. The Honorable Judge Beatrice Cole presiding. Beatrice took her seat behind the elevated bench, her gavel resting in one hand. She looked directly at Martinez's empty defense table. Today begins the formal hearing into the conduct of Officer Martin Martinez and the systemic failures that allowed misconduct to be concealed under our roof. Then she looked to the gallery. Her eyes met Caleb's. Her voice softened just a breath. And today, justice wears her robe again. Tessa clutched her father's hand. Is she the boss now? Caleb smiled. No, honey. She's the truth. The doors to courtroom 3A creaked open wider as more people filed in. Word had spread fast, too fast for it to be from a press release. It had the rhythm of something deeper, organic, uncontrolled, undeniable. Clerks whispered, reporters scrambled, legal aides with folded laptops slipped into benches like parishioners arriving late to an unexpected sermon. Everyone sensed it. Something unusual was about to unfold. Caleb Turner sat in the third row, stone-still hands resting gently on Tessa's shoulders as she perched beside him. She didn't fidget. She didn't hum. Even at 8 years old, she understood that this moment didn't need words. From the corner of the room, Martinez entered with his union attorney. His gait was different today, less swagger, more stiffness. The way he scanned the benches said it all. He hadn't expected this much attention. He especially hadn't expected her. Beatrice Cole stood at the bench, not seated, not towering, standing in quiet authority. The black robe with golden trim hugged her like armor, forged not from silk, but from experience. No microphone squealed, no gavel struck. Only the calm, level voice of the court clerk. This courtroom is now in session. The Honorable Judge Beatrice Cole presiding. A pause. Then it happened. Martinez's attorney stood up, blinking. I beg your pardon, I was informed this hearing would be led by a neutral federal judge, not Beatrice's eyes didn't flinch. "Let me clarify for the record," she said, voice crisp and calm. "I am that judge." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. "You were the attorney," stammered the alleged victim. "You were attacked. This violates protocol." Beatrice didn't raise her voice. "I was never recused. I was never charged. The preliminary suspension of my panel chairship was temporary pending security review, which has now been completed and overturned by the Ethics Oversight Committee." She gestured calmly to the document placed before her, already signed by 3 justices and 2 internal oversight officers. "I am fully reinstated, and under judiciary protocol, I have the authority to preside over disciplinary inquiries when seniority permits. In this district," she said, lifting her eyes directly to Martinez, "I am the senior authority." Caleb leaned forward in his seat, his pulse low and steady. He watched Martinez's lips part, then close again. A man trained to bark orders, now wordless in the face of the very truth he had tried to erase. Beatrice finally took her seat. Her robe flowed around her like a black tide. "I am not here today as someone seeking vengeance," she began. "I am here to speak for the integrity of this court, and for those who have stood silently too long in the face of abuse, masquerading as authority." She paused, letting it breathe. "Before we begin testimony, I will allow the defense to file an objection to my position if they wish to delay proceedings further." Martinez's attorney whispered something rapidly. The officer fidgeted, looking around the room. Every camera lens now pointed at him, every eye focused. "No objection," the attorney said at last. Beatrice nodded, then let the hearing begin. The first screen flickered on. Surveillance footage, multiple angles. Beatrice walking calmly toward the courthouse steps. Martinez approaching. Smack, grab, shove. Then Caleb stepping in. Tessa in the background. The frozen moment that had shaken a nation. But now it played again, not on the news, not through opinion, not with a voiceover, just raw and quiet and undeniable. Beatrice turned to the security officer on duty that day, one who had stood on the sidelines. "Did Officer Martinez request backup prior to using force?" "No, ma'am." "Did he radio for supervisory clearance?" "No, ma'am." "Did he file a report within the mandatory 30-minute window after using physical force?" There was a pause. He filed the report 2 hours later. She turned to Martinez. "Officer, do you contest this footage?" He crossed his arms. "It lacks context." Beatrice's eyes didn't flicker. "Then I invite you to provide that context now." Under oath, a deep pause. Martinez's lawyer stood. "We respectfully decline to testify at this time." Beatrice nodded once. "Understood. The record will reflect that refusal." Then she did something unexpected. She turned to Caleb. "Mr. Turner, would you approach the bench?" Caleb stood slowly tall and steady. Tessa gripped her bunny tighter, but didn't cry out. She only watched her father with wide, steady eyes. He took the witness stand. "State your name for the record." "Caleb James Turner. Occupation veteran. Full-time parent. Part-time maintenance worker at the VA clinic." Beatrice leaned forward gently. "Mr. Turner, did you witness the events of September 15th outside this courthouse?" "I did." "Did the defendant, Officer Martinez, strike you?" "No." "Did he strike me?" "Yes." "With his hand, then shoved you against a stone column. Was there any sign I was resisting?" "None." "And what compelled you to intervene?" He turned, slightly looking out toward the audience, toward Tessa. My daughter was watching. The room held its breath. He turned back to Beatrice. "I wanted her to see that silence isn't always noble. Sometimes it's cowardice in a suit." Beatrice's voice was soft now. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. You may step down." Caleb returned to his seat. Tessa leaned her head on his arm, whispering, "You did great." And then for a long moment, Beatrice looked out at the room. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a judge. A woman who had reclaimed her place, not with noise, but with truth calmly told. "This court will reconvene tomorrow for disciplinary recommendation hearings, but let it be known," she said, her voice unwavering, "the robe does not grant power. Integrity does." The gavel fell. And in that room, full of murmurs and shifting minds, the silence that followed was not discomfort. It was respect. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of courtroom 3A, like judgment itself, cool, precise, and unflinching. The air held that particular kind of tension, known only in places where truth is about to be uncovered. Not speculated, not suggested. Uncovered. The courtroom was at capacity. Reporters from every major network lined the back row. Lawyers, clerks, veterans advocates, and junior officers now attended, not as professionals, but as witnesses to a reckoning. Caleb and Tessa sat in their usual spot, third row center, just close enough to see Beatrice's eyes without needing to hear her voice. Tessa leaned close and whispered, "Is today the day the bad man says sorry?" Caleb gave a quiet smile. "Let's find out." Beatrice Cole entered not with fanfare, but with focus. Her robe swept softly behind her like a trailing thought, an echo of every woman who had ever been overlooked, misjudged, or doubted, and refused to disappear. "All rise," the clerk's voice carried like a bell. Beatrice took her seat behind the bench. Then she turned to her left, gesturing toward a large display screen now connected to the federal court's digital archive. For the record, she began, "Today's proceedings will focus on the review of supplementary evidence related to Officer Martinez's prior conduct. These records were recently unsealed under Judiciary Directive 7, which allows cross-reference between internal misconduct complaints and federal civil court actions when patterns of abuse are alleged." There were gasps in the room. Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer already flipping through a file folder that seemed far too thin. Beatrice remained composed. "Clerk, please cue Exhibit 22A. The screen flickered to life. Footage played from 3 years earlier, body cam footage from another officer during a courthouse altercation. A black veteran, clearly disoriented, was seen trying to find the correct courtroom. Martinez approached, aggressively shouting orders before the man even turned around. Then came the moment. Martinez shoved him face first against a wall. "Suspect failed to comply," the voice on the footage said. "Pause," Beatrice instructed. She looked to the room. "This man," she said, tapping her file, was later released without charge. The complaint was sealed under insufficient evidence, despite this footage. He received a broken nose and a concussion. The audience was dead silent. Next clip. Footage rolled again, this time from courthouse security cameras. No audio, just Martinez, again blocking a Latina legal assistant at the metal detector. She showed her ID 3 times. He never looked at it. He escorted her out of the building. She never returned to work. "Filed as a voluntary resignation," Beatrice said dryly. She was never interviewed. Her complaint was discarded. She let that sit for a moment before turning her gaze to Martinez. "Officer Martinez," she said, "you were named in 6 internal complaints over the last 4 years, all sealed. Would you like to explain that pattern to the court?" Martinez's jaw locked. His lawyer stood quickly. "My client declines to respond at this time, Your Honor." "Declining to respond," Beatrice said coolly, "is not the same as disproving." She turned back to the screen. Now for the footage that matters most. And with that, the final video began. It was the now infamous clip, but this time from a new angle. From the body cam of the second officer present that day. Unlike Martinez's corrupted version, this one showed everything. Beatrice walking, calmly presenting her ID. Martinez's voice. Another one thinking she's got rights. Then the slap, the shove, the line that echoed now across the country. Filthy animals like you belong in cages. Beatrice did not look away. She let it play. All of it. When it ended, there was no outrage from her. Just silence. Then this was submitted anonymously by a clerk who found it misfiled in an inactive folder. Their integrity is noted. She paused. Officer Martinez, you may not respond, but I will. She stood. No officer is above the law. No badge grants you the right to choose who is worthy of dignity. The uniform you wear represents the Constitution, not your prejudice. And the silence of those around you, those who excused, ignored, or buried, this ends today. Then she turned to the clerk. Read the final charge recommendations. The clerk stood, voice unwavering. The court recommends Officer Martin Martinez be referred to Federal Review for Civil Rights Violations, falsification of official records, and unlawful use of force against a sitting judge. The court further recommends a Department of Justice investigation into the pattern of abuse under his supervision. There was a long collective breath in the room, not of shock, of relief. Martinez stood, red-faced fists, clenched, but unmoving. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder. Beatrice turned to the audience now, not as a judge, but as a voice. To those who have been silenced, overlooked, or disbelieved, let this moment be proof that the system can still remember its promise, that justice is not about appearance, but about truth. And truth is not afraid of cameras. Her eyes fell once more on Caleb and Tessa. He met her gaze with a quiet nod. Tessa lifted her hand, tiny and determined, and gave a thumbs up. Beatrice smiled. Then at last the gavel fell. This hearing is concluded. No applause, no dramatic music, just that heavy sacred stillness that only follows real justice. The truth had unfolded. And this time, it didn't whisper. It echoed. The corridors of the courthouse felt different now, less like a battlefield, and more like the heavy silence that settles over sacred ground after a storm. The world outside was roaring with headlines, but inside time had slowed. Beatrice Cole stood in her chambers, her robe still draped across the back of the chair, the ceremonial gavel set beside a worn leather briefcase. Her hands rested on the edge of the desk, her eyes staring not at the room, but through it, toward something far beyond the walls. A knock at the door pulled her back. It opened, and Caleb stepped in, holding a single white envelope in one hand. "I figured you might be in here," he said, offering a faint smile. Beatrice turned. They delivered the final transcripts. He handed her the envelope. Certified and sealed. DOJ is assigning a special prosecutor. Martinez has been placed on leave pending indictment. She exhaled slowly, the kind of breath one takes not out of relief, but out of release. The kind you give yourself when you've held too much for too long. "Have you slept?" Caleb asked gently. She nodded, enough to remember what it feels like to wake up without regret. He leaned against the doorframe. That's a good kind of tired. They stood in comfortable silence. Outside the chamber window, golden leaves drifted through the courtyard like nature's confetti, quiet, beautiful, fleeting. "I heard from Judge Daniels." Beatrice said, her voice quieter now. "He called the inquiry historic. Said, I restored dignity to the robe. Funny how people only say that after you bleed." Caleb didn't laugh. He only nodded. "That's because most people don't know how heavy justice really is." Beatrice turned to him, searching his face. "Did you always know how to carry it?" "No," Caleb said. "I just promised someone I wouldn't put it down." Later that afternoon, the three of them, Caleb, Beatrice, and Tessa, stood outside the courthouse steps, the same ones where it had all begun. The plaza was quieter now. The media had moved on to new stories, but the ripples of what had happened here still moved beneath the surface. You could see it in how officers held the doors open with a nod, how court clerks spoke to civilians with a touch more care, how people paused before raising their voices. Tessa stood between them, one hand in Caleb's, one in Beatrice's. She tilted her head upward, peering at the tall stone facade. "Will they fix it?" she asked. "Fix what?" Beatrice replied, kneeling beside her. "The courthouse, the way it broke before." Beatrice smiled gently. "The building didn't break, sweetheart. People did. But buildings, they can be cleaned. People have to choose to change." Tessa looked thoughtful. "Did you choose to change?" Beatrice's gaze flicked upward toward Caleb. "Yes, I chose to stop being quiet when the noise got ugly." And Daddy Caleb bent down next to them. "I chose to show you that even when something's scary, it's scarier to pretend you didn't see it." Tessa nodded, as if filing those words away deep in her heart. A courthouse staffer walked by and stopped glancing at Beatrice. "Judge Cole." The woman smiled softly. "There's a veteran and his daughter in family court. He asked for you. Said he saw the news. He just wanted to say thank you." Beatrice blinked. "I'll be right there." The woman nodded and left. Beatrice stood and turned to Caleb. "You think it matters?" she asked. "All of this?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he gently reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded drawing, one of Tessa's. It was crude, childlike, and powerful. A woman in a long robe, standing tall between two frightened children. Behind her, a courthouse with golden light shining from the windows, and written in shaky block letters beneath, "She didn't let the bad things win." Beatrice stared at it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes shimmered, not with sadness, but with something far more vulnerable. "Hope," she whispered. "You kept your promise." Caleb's voice was soft. "We all did." That evening, Tessa curled up in bed as the orange light of sunset bathed the room. Caleb sat beside her, tucking the blanket beneath her chin. "Will the judge come back tomorrow?" she asked sleepily. "She has other people to help," Caleb said. "But maybe someday she'll come back. Or maybe she'll stay in our story forever like the brave people in your books." Tessa yawned. "I hope she stays," I think Caleb said, brushing her hair from her forehead. "She already has." As he stood and turned to leave, Tessa murmured behind him, barely audible, "Daddy." He turned. "Yeah, I'm glad you didn't look away." Caleb's throat tightened. "I'm glad you didn't too." Outside, Beatrice stood in the courtyard alone beneath a maple tree, the branches overhead a crown of burning orange. She looked up at the darkening sky. The world was still imperfect. But tonight it was honest. And that was enough. 3 weeks later, the city felt different. Not louder, not softer, more awake. In coffee shops and train stations, people still talked about the Judge Cole hearing. Caleb had overheard snippets in line at the pharmacy, an older couple saying, "She stood her ground with such grace," and a veteran in a ball cap whispering, "About time someone called them out." But it wasn't just the whispers. The real change was in motion. On Capitol Hill, the Department of Justice had quietly opened inquiries into sealed cases across multiple federal courthouses, most of them previously discarded under procedural dismissals. The FBI had begun interviews. Patterns were forming. Some called it the Cole Doctrine. Others called it inconvenient. Beatrice called it overdue. And for Caleb Turner, the ripples weren't just on the news, they were in his life. He was standing in front of the podium at the National Civic Auditorium, uncomfortable in a borrowed blazer, adjusting his collar, while his daughter adjusted his tie for the 5th time. "You look like a superhero," Tessa whispered, beaming up at him. "I feel like a janitor who got tricked into a banquet," he murmured, tugging at the starched fabric again. Beatrice stood nearby, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, wearing a deep navy dress with silver trim. Not a robe, not a suit. A statement. "The Secretary of Veterans Affairs is in the second row," she said, calmly scanning the crowd. Caleb let out a slow breath. "Great. No pressure. You faced down a corrupt system and protected a federal judge with a child in your arms. This is the easy part." He gave her a look. She offered a tiny, victorious smirk. "Just don't trip," she added. Before he could reply, a voice rang out across the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our honorees for the Citizens of Courage Award." Applause filled the hall, warm and genuine. A federal director stepped onto the stage. "Tonight we honor not politicians or celebrities, but ordinary citizens who did something extraordinary, not with force, but with integrity." The room quieted. When Judge Beatrice Cole was assaulted on the steps of her own courthouse, the nation watched in horror. But one man didn't just watch. He acted. Not because he had to, not because he had power, but because he refused to look away. The spotlight found Caleb, and standing beside him was a young girl who reminded us all why courage matters in the first place. Tessa gripped her father's hand, eyes wide but unafraid. They walked to the stage together. As Caleb stepped to the microphone, the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. He didn't speak for a moment. He just stood there, a single dad, in a thrift store blazer, with his daughter beside him, and 1,000 eyes watching. When he did speak, his voice was steady. "I've served overseas. I've seen real war. I've also seen what happens when silence becomes easier than standing up." He looked out over the audience, then down at Tessa, whose small fingers still clutched his. "I didn't act that morning to be a hero. I acted because my daughter was watching, and I want her to grow up in a country where courage is contagious, where right still matters, even when it's quiet." More applause, some tears. He stepped back. Beatrice took his place at the podium, her voice calm as always, but threaded with something softer tonight. Sometimes justice isn't a ruling, it's a choice, and it doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears boots, or carries a bunny, or stands between a stranger and a badge. Laughter rippled gently through the room. She looked toward Caleb and Tessa, her voice lowering. "I didn't expect anyone to step in for me that day. But someone did. And because of that, truth got to finish its sentence." The applause this time was louder. As the ceremony ended, they walked out into the night together. The stars above the Capitol dome shimmered like lanterns strung across the heavens. Tessa skipped ahead, chasing a leaf that danced in the wind. Caleb turned to Beatrice. "You ever think we'd end up here?" She smiled softly. "Not in 1,000 years." He looked over at his daughter, then back at her. "You know I'm not sure what happens next. I don't have some big plan." Beatrice's voice was quiet. "Maybe we don't need one. Maybe we just keep showing up." He offered her his arm. She took it. And together, beneath a sky filled with quiet stars and long shadows, they walked forward, not as judge and witness, not as headlines or symbols, but as people. Changed, awake, and still standing. The morning broke clear and quiet, the kind of crisp October day that made Washington, D.C. feel less like a city and more like a promise. Gold leaves spun lazily in the breeze, dotting the sidewalk like fallen metals. The courthouse stood still against the pale blue sky, not just a building now, but a monument to something deeper. Caleb Turner stood at the edge of the courthouse plaza, dressed in his old Marine jacket, not for ceremony, but because it still felt like armor. Beside him, Tessa wore her favorite white cardigan, gripping a small paper scroll tied with blue ribbon. And waiting ahead beneath a freshly polished bronze plaque was Beatrice Cole. She stood tall in a long tan overcoat, her hair pulled back, face calm, but alight with something rare: peace. A small crowd had gathered: judges, veterans, law students, janitors, court staff, and a scattering of civilians who had followed the story from the beginning. No podium, no microphones, just people. Tessa tugged on Caleb's sleeve. "Daddy, why does the sign still say West Plaza Entrance?" Caleb smiled. "That's about to change." A court clerk approached with a clipboard and soft voice. "We're ready when you are, Judge Cole." Beatrice turned to the crowd, stepping onto the shallow steps where it had all begun. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This is not a dedication," she said gently. "This is a correction." Her eyes scanned the faces, some familiar, some not. Justice doesn't happen in headlines. It happens in moments, the kind we live through when nobody's watching, and the kind we stand up for when everyone is. She looked toward Caleb and Tessa. And sometimes it starts with a man holding his daughter's hand and saying, "This isn't right." Tessa smiled, her eyes bright and unblinking. Beatrice gestured to the plaque. The cloth was drawn back. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Etched in bold lettering, Turner Cole Plaza, dedicated to those who refuse to look away. October 15th, 2025. Caleb blinked, stunned. "You didn't tell me it would have my name," he said quietly. Beatrice smiled. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. I'm not the one who changed the system. You're the one who made them look." Reporters began scribbling. A few people clapped softly at first, then more fully as others joined in. But it wasn't loud applause. It was warm, sincere. As the crowd began to disperse, people came up one by one. A young court clerk shook Caleb's hand. A grandmother thanked Tessa for her bravery bunny. An older Marine nodded once at Beatrice with silent pride. When it quieted again, the three of them remained alone beneath the morning sun. "Want a walk?" Beatrice asked. Caleb nodded. "Always." They walked slowly beneath the rows of maple trees lining the edge of the plaza. Tessa ran ahead, chasing a swirl of leaves, arms spread like wings. Beatrice tucked her arm gently around Caleb's. "You know," she said, "before all this, I was ready to step down." He turned to her, surprised. "Seriously?" She nodded. "I thought I'd burned out. That no one listened anymore. That I was just patching cracks in a wall too old to hold. Then, you showed up." Caleb's voice was quiet. "I didn't do anything special. You stood still when others backed away," she said. "That's the kind of special the world forgets it needs." They stopped at a bench overlooking the Capitol in the distance. Tessa joined them, climbing onto the bench with a huff. Beatrice reached into her pocket and handed Tessa a folded paper. "What's this?" Tessa asked. "Open it." Inside was a sketch, a courthouse drawn in soft pencil strokes, with 3 stick figures on the steps. One tall, in a judge's robe, one with a green jacket and long hair, and one tiny one with bunny ears drawn on the head. At the top, written in careful grown-up handwriting, "Sometimes justice looks like family." Tessa beamed. "Did you draw this?" "I did," Beatrice said. Tessa held it to her chest. "Can we hang it on the fridge?" Caleb laughed. "We'll find a frame." They sat together for a long moment, watching the city come alive around them. Nothing needed to be said, because everything that mattered had already been done. This wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. A judge who found her voice again, a single dad who rediscovered his purpose, and a little girl who watched them both and learned that kindness is powerful and courage can be quiet, and the world gets better when even one person says, "Not today." As the sun lifted higher and bathed the Turner Cole Plaza in gold, Beatrice reached for Caleb's hand. "Let's keep walking." And they did. Together. Into a new dawn. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from. Drop a comment and share your thoughts on today's story. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to Soul Moment Story for more true-to-life tales of courage, kindness, and quiet strength. Thank you for spending time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right.